Welcome back to a brand new episode of Bonsai-U. In this edition, we're going to be talking about Literati or Bunjin style bonsai. We're going to be applying those concepts to this collected Virginia pine. Now, before we jump into wiring and styling this tree, I want to talk to you guys about what Bunjin style bonsai is all about. Now, my guess is that your interpretation of Bunjin style bonsai is what you see right before you here. A very long, wispy trunk, very thin, with a majority of the foliage emanating from the top of the tree. Well, this really is a sort of modern interpretation of Bunjin style bonsai. In order to really understand the history and the roots of Bunjin style bonsai though, we need to go all the way back in history to the 1400s and talk about a guy named Ashikaga Yoshimasa. Now, Ashikaga Yoshimasa was the shogun of Japan during the 1400s, which meant that he was a military leader, military ruler of the country. Well, during that particular period that he was ruling, there were a lot of wars that were going on. As a matter of fact, the city of Kyoto, where he was based, burned down 4 or 5 times during his rule. So at some point, he got fed up with dealing with all of the politics, and he decided to build himself a pavilion on the eastern side of Kyoto in the Higashiyama area. It's a place called Ginkakuji, or the Silver Pavilion. It's still around to this day, so you can go and check it out if you ever visit Kyoto. Now, he moved there so that he could kind of live as a recluse and study the arts. He was big into Southern Song Chinese paintings. Now, these paintings were characterized by being monochromatic, so one color, not a lot of actual paint applied to the canvas itself or to the kakejiku itself, so a lot of open negative spaces. So for example, when landscapes were painted, there might be a little scene of a mountain up in the top, a little scene of a mountain down below, and nothing painted in between. But your brain and your eyes are supposed to fill in that there are mountains that exist in between, but it's the mist that's covering up those mountains. So Ashikaga Yoshimasa was big into that type of art. We also know that he was big into bonsai, or more specifically something called bonseki, which is basically tray landscapes. And the reason we know this is because there's documentation of him actually judging a bonseki show during that period in the 1400s. So we know for sure he was interested in bonsai or interested in bonseki. Now, in terms of Literati style bonsai, during that particular period, any tree that a Bunjin or a Literati or learned person was interested in or liked would have been considered a Bunjin bonsai, a bonsai of the Bunjin or of the Literati. So for example, if Ashikaga Yoshimasa had liked chokan style trees or formal upright trees, that would have been considered a Literati bonsai back in those days. It wasn't until several hundred years later in 1868, when Japan's doors were open to the Western world, that a transformation started to occur in Japan, and a shift in aesthetic preference, particularly up in Tokyo, started moving more towards what you see right here. And this is again what we consider sort of Literati style bonsai in the modern sense right now. This came from that transformative period in Japanese history, from the Meiji period up through the Taisho period. So what we think of now as Literati, with having, very slender trunks, very little movement in the trunks, and a majority of the foliage emanating from the top, came from that new Tokyo aesthetic from about 1868 onward. Now, there was one more sort of shift in aesthetic preference as it relates to Bunjin style bonsai, and that was in the 1970s and 1980s. And that was more towards trees that had more motion in the trunks, but still maintained that very slender trunk line and still had a majority of the foliage emanating from the top. So if you go to Japan nowadays, for example, if you go to the Taikon 10, which is an exhibition in November in Kyoto, the Literati style trees that are on display tend more towards that aesthetic. They tend to be a little bit more whimsical, a lot more motion in the trunk than what you see in front of you right here. So now that you guys have a grasp of the history of Bunjin style bonsai, let's talk about designing this particular tree right here. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, this is a collected Virginia pine. It was actually collected in East Tennessee in the Smoky Mountains at a relatively low elevation. Now, you probably noticed that the needles on the tree are turning yellow. It's actually fall here in Nashville at Eisei-en, so the 2-year-old needles on this tree are starting to naturally fall off. So the first step in designing this tree is going to be to clean out those old needles, but I'm going to make sure that I'm not removing any needle buds or adventitious buds as I do that. So I'm going to be extra careful in pulling those needles off. Once we remove those needles, we can talk a little bit about the design of the branches and where the branch placement should be. So now that the old yellowing needles have been removed, it's much more obvious now to see that the top of the tree here has much more density to it in terms of the foliage than the lower branch here towards the rear. Now, again, I mentioned earlier that we're going to be designing this tree as a Bunjin style bonsai, of course, and a majority of the foliage needs to emanate from the top of the tree. That being said, that doesn't mean that you can't have a nice low branch that cascades down the trunk. And I want to actually use this branch to the rear here that's dipping down as that cascading branch. I think it's going to look quite unique, quite interesting with that. So in order to keep that branch alive, make sure that it's nice and healthy, we need to balance the foliar density from the top of the tree to the bottom of the tree. So what that means is I'm going to go through and remove some of the needles from this year, some of that new growth, to give us a consistent density on the top of the tree with the bottom of the tree. So in other words, the bottom of the tree is going to be what dictates the density of the top of the tree. So the next step here is going to be to remove a lot of those new needles from the top here. So as I'm doing this again, I'm looking for the buds that are further back down the branch here, and I want to be careful not to remove those. So of course we've got this bud right here with a lot of needles around it. We've got the terminal bud out here at the end. We also have another bud a little bit further back right here. So what I'm going to do is remove some of these old needles from the underside of the branch and then a few of the needles between, say, the terminal bud here and this bud, and between this bud and the one a little bit further back on the branch. So as you do this, you just want to make sure that you're being very careful not to grab the needles that are surrounding these buds further back in, because of course we don't want to rip those off. So as I'm removing these needles on the upper portion of the tree here, I want to sort of explain the inspiration for designing this tree. There is a very famous tree in Japan, or there was a famous tree in Japan. It was a Japanese white pine that was named Kuon, K-U-O-N. I believe it was part of the Takagi collection, which eventually became the collection that was donated to the Omiya Bonsai Museum up in Saitama. But it's a very famous white pine that had a very long cascading branch. It was a Bunjin style tree that had a very long cascading branch that actually emanated from the top of the tree and cascaded all the way down the side. So I want to design this tree with that in mind, using that kind of as inspiration for the final structure and setup of this particular Bunjin bonsai. Now that we've thinned out the top of the tree to match the density of that lower branch, I want to spin the tree to the side so that you can see exactly where this lower branch is emanating from. Now we're going to have to manipulate this branch down and closer to the trunk to get that true Bunjin style. So let me spin this first so you can see what I'm talking about here. This is looking at the tree from the right side. You can see that this branch here actually emanates directly out of the back. Now, when I potted this tree up in the spring, I made sure to put it on an angle where you don't actually see the shoulder of this branch emanating from the trunk. It's coming directly out of the rear. I wanted to hide that because this branch is actually the same diameter as the trunk line that rises above it. So it's not really an ideal situation. So as one way to hide that, you can make sure to place the shoulder of that branch where it comes out of the trunk directly behind the trunk, and then you don't see that. The problem is we've got this big bow that sticks out of the rear here. Now, when you're designing a Bunjin style bonsai, one of the main characteristics that we're looking for is to create branches that are nice and tight and that flow down the side of the trunk and actually mimic that trunk line to some degree. So in order to make that happen with this branch and to get this branch low enough, we're going to have to guy wire this branch nice and tight up against the trunk here. Now, for the safety of the branch, I'm not going to crank it all the way down today, and I don't necessarily want to put raffia on this branch to protect it, because it's going to ruin a lot of that nice characteristic bark that's on there, that gnarly looking textured bark. So I don't want to knock that off. So we're going to take it down to a certain degree today. It'll still have that kind of bowed effect, but little by little over the next 6, 8, 10, 12 months, we're going to pull that branch down and further in towards the trunk. So what I'm going to do actually before I put that guy wire on to crank it down, I'm going to apply a little bit of wire out here at the end of the branch so that when I pull it down, I don't have to really worry about weaving that wrapped wire through the guy wire. So keep that in mind. If you know you're going to have to apply a guy wire, go ahead and apply the wrapped wire first, because it'll save you a lot of trouble in the long run. Okay, so as you can see, we've got the initial primary structure established on this tree. I think we did a good job of kind of mimicking or using Kuon as inspiration for this particular tree. We've got that cascading branch that runs down the left side of the tree right there. Now what I wanted to do is sort of mimic the trunk line to some degree, but I also wanted to give that branch a sense of power, so I didn't want it to just flop. So at the ends, I've actually lifted up all of the tips. And as a matter of fact, with Bunjin style trees in general, we typically raise the tips of the foliage up a little bit more than we would with other styles of trees. It gives it a softer, more elegant look. So that's what I've done with this one. I've raised those branch tips upward, not completely straight up, but I have lifted them more than I would with other styles. Say for example, formal upright or informal upright. I typically would make those a little bit flatter, but with this I wanted that nice soft lift to give us that elegance. Now up here at the top we have two branches, so I took one of those to the rear to give us some depth, which is what you see right here. The other branch I cascaded down in a similar manner to the lower branch, so we get a replication of that theme on the top and on the bottom as well. So this tree needs to fill in a little bit over the next couple of years. I'd like to see it with about, say, 25% more foliar density at some point before it goes into exhibition, but I think it'll take probably 1 to 2 growing seasons for that to happen. So what I'm gonna do next is remove the wire and the support here down at the base, which was put in there just to keep the tree stable this year while it acclimated to its new condition in the pot. We're gonna remove that right now, and we're gonna put the tree in the tokonoma so you can see it in a proper setting. So as you can see in the tokonoma setting, this tree really stands out. This is one of those trees that when you put it in the right environment, it makes it pop. It really makes it beautiful, and all the characteristics that we're trying to bring out of the tree really shine. So I want to thank you guys so much for checking out this episode of Bonsai-U. If you like what we do here, make sure to like and subscribe down below. And if you really like what we do here and you want to support us beyond just liking and subscribing, you can click on the link in the description down below. It'll take you over to our website and you can donate to help Bonsai-U going forward. Thank you guys again for checking out this episode, and we'll see you guys next time. Take care.